Welcome to Inside Criminology. I'm your host, and in today's deep dive based on Chapter 7 of Larry J. Siegel's Criminology, we examine how crime is not just committed, but learned. From the power of peer influence to the lasting impact of being labeled a delinquent, this deep dive explores how social interactions and institutions shape the path toward or away from criminal behavior.
That's exactly what we're digging into today, the world of social process theories. We've previously explored how things like social structure or maybe individual traits might influence crime, but this perspective asks a really fundamental question.
Yeah, how do our relationships, our day-to-day interactions, and the institutions we're part of, how do they shape our potential for criminal behavior?
Precisely.
It's a powerful idea because think about it, regardless of where you start in life or who your parents are, everyone has the potential to get involved in crime. So what are those social forces that nudge some people towards, let's say, conventional paths and others towards criminal ones?
Right. And this view argues that criminality really is a function of how individuals are socialized and how they interact with key groups and institutions, like family, schools, peer groups, and even, interestingly, the justice system itself.
Okay. And to get a handle on this, the source unpacks three major branches of this theory.
That's right. We've got social learning theory, which essentially says crime is learned behavior.
Okay.
Then there's social control theory, which takes a different angle and asks why people don't commit crime.
Interesting flip.
And finally, social reaction, or maybe better known as labeling theory, which looks at the profound impact of actually being labeled as criminal or delinquent.
Okay, let's unpack this by first digging into those critical elements of socialization that criminologists pinpoint as having the biggest impact.
Absolutely. Before we even get to the theories themselves, understanding the building blocks
Yeah.
and the key ingredients in that socialization process that are linked, for better or worse, to behavior is essential.
And the family seems like the absolute foundation here, doesn't it? It comes up constantly.
It really is. The family is a major determinant of behavior. And it's not just about, say, whether it's a two-parent or single-parent home, though research does link family structure to crime rates.
Right.
Partly because changes in structure can mean less income, maybe moves to more disorganized neighborhoods, which strains things like supervision. But what the source really emphasizes is the quality of the parenting itself. Things like inconsistent discipline, poor supervision, a lack of warm, supportive parent-child relationships. These consistently and significantly increase the risk.
So it's less about the specific structure, like who's in the house, and more about how the family actually functions day to day.
Exactly. Supportive parents who have good parental efficacy, meaning they can effectively guide their children in a positive, non-coercive way, they're just much more likely to raise kids who steer clear of trouble.
Makes.
Conversely, troubled home lives aren't just, unhappy places. They're linked to lower self-esteem and antisocial behavior. Whereas warm, connected family ties are linked to higher self-esteem, and that seems to be inversely related to crime.
So the quality of the relationship is key.
It's the nature of the relationship and the quality of control that seems to matter most, yeah.
And sadly, the source also points to a strong suspected link between child abuse and later crime.
Yes, and the evidence here is pretty significant. Studies show a strong association between experiencing child abuse, neglect, or sexual abuse, and criminal behavior later in life.
It has long-term effects.
Huge long-term effects. Abused children often face mental and social problems across their lifespan, including things like substance abuse and really damaged personalities.
Wow.
And what's particularly striking is research suggesting that even corporal punishment, depending on the context and how often it happens, can increase the likelihood of using violence later. It's linked to anger, spousal abuse, depression, and adult crime, especially in societies that are already more violent.
So that early trauma can really set a path.
It seems to have lasting harmful effects on development and behavior, absolutely.
Okay, moving beyond the home then, the school environment also plays a huge role.
It absolutely does. The educational experience is critical. Things like poor school performance, a lack of motivation, feeling alienated or disconnected at school, these are strongly linked to criminality.
So failing at school isn't just about grades.
Not at all. The source notes that kids who fail in school tend to offend more frequently, commit more serious acts, and are more likely to persist in offending right into adulthood. It really impacts their sense of belonging and success in a conventional setting.
And the characteristics of the school itself matter too, like the building or the area.
They do seem to. The source points out that secondary schools, for example, are more likely to have violent incidents than elementary or middle schools.
Okay.
Larger schools also tend to report more violent incidents, and urban schools typically see more crime than suburban or rural ones. So the environment you're in day to day outside the home definitely has its own influences.
Which brings us to dropping out. That must be a significant risk factor.
Oh, it's strongly linked to delinquency.
Yeah.
But interestingly, dropping out often isn't the root cause itself. It's frequently a result of underlying social and emotional problems. Things like family conflict, substance abuse, maybe teenage pregnancy. So school becomes a stage where existing problems can kind of worsen or reveal themselves, pushing someone further down a risky path.
Right. Okay, peer relations. This is probably the one everyone thinks of first, especially during those teenage years.
Absolutely critical, especially in adolescence.
Yeah.
Inadequate or strained peer relations, feeling unpopular, these are strongly linked to delinquency.
Yeah.
And peer rejection, particularly for kids who are already aggressive, can actually sort of lock them into a cycle of persistent violence.
Wow.
And yes, the classic idea of falling in with a bad crowd is central here. Associating with antisocial peers dramatically increases delinquency risk, often regardless of a person's personality or even how much supervision they get at home.
So it's not just that you hang out with similar people, but they actively influence you.
Yes. The source makes it clear these deviant peers provide actual friendship networks that support delinquency and drug use.
Okay.
They offer opportunities for deviant acts
Right.
and even provide social reinforcement for them. The source uses a really interesting term. These friendships can be sticky.
Sticky.
Yeah, like once you acquire them, they're not easily lost, and that peer influence continues. What's also highlighted is a potential gender difference. Males seem more likely to socialize with deviant peers and appear to be more deeply influenced by them than females, possibly because of differences in how they think about morality or social harm.
Interesting distinction. So you have these core social spheres, family, school, peers. What about involvement in broader institutions, like clubs or community stuff?
That's the final piece in this foundational look at socialization. Involvement in conventional institutions. Yeah, things like clubs, community groups, maybe religious organizations, and simply adhering to conventional beliefs are also highlighted as crucial.
So being connected helps.
Definitely. Kids who are socialized with proper values and beliefs and who have strong ties to these institutions are just less likely to get involved in crime. Those strong ties act as a form of social control.
And the opposite is true too.
A lack of attachment or commitment to these mainstream institutions really does increase the risk of antisocial behavior.
Okay, that gives us the landscape of where this socialization happens. Now, how do theories explain how it leads to crime? That brings us to our first major branch, social learning theory.
Right. Social learning theory looks directly at how those interactions we just discussed actually result in criminal behavior. The fundamental premise here is that people aren't born, good or bad.
Okay.
Instead, crime is learned, just like you learn anything else from riding a bike to speaking a language.
So it's about acquiring the specific norms, values, and behaviors associated with criminal activity, like learning the ropes.
Precisely. And that includes both the practical stuff, the techniques, like how to hotwire a car or something, and the more psychological aspects, like learning how to rationalize the behavior or deal with potential guilt or shame.
And the towering figure here is Edwin H. Sutherland with his differential association theory.
Sutherland is really considered the preeminent U.S. criminologist in this area. His core idea, boiled down, is that criminality is learned through interaction, and the most powerful learning happens within our intimate personal groups, family, close friends, peers.
So it all comes back to socialization.
Fundamentally, yes. It's a function of socialization.
He broke this down into a set of key principles. What are the most important ones for us to grasp here?
Okay, so among his 9 principles, here are the big takeaways. Criminal behavior is learned, not inherited. It's learned in interaction with others, primarily within those intimate personal groups.
Right.
The learning involves not just the techniques, but critically, the specific direction of motives and drives, like why you'd want to do it. And these motives and drives are learned from how people define the legal code, whether they see it as something to be respected or something to be disregarded or even violated. People can experience culture conflict when they're exposed to opposing attitudes towards the law from different groups they're involved with.
And not all these interactions carry the same weight, right?
That's a key part of it. Sutherland said differential associations vary in frequency, how often you're exposed, duration, how long, priority, how early in life these contacts happen, and intensity, how important or prestigious the source is to you.
So who you learn from matters a lot.
Absolutely. And learning criminal behavior is fundamentally similar to learning anything else. But here's the punchline. Criminal behavior happens only when someone is exposed to an excess of definitions favorable to violating the law compared to definitions unfavorable to it.
So the core insight is you learn these pro-crime attitudes and behaviors from the people close to you, and you move towards a criminal path if those antisocial values aren't outweighed by conventional ones. It's like a tipping point.
That's the essence. And research, despite the challenge of measuring something vague like definitions toward criminality, generally supports the core idea. Studies show a clear correlation between having deviant friends, holding deviant attitudes, and committing deviant acts.
And hanging out with those friends keeps those attitudes going.
Exactly. Association with those deviant peers seems to reinforce and sustain deviant attitudes.
It makes perfect sense when you think about things like getting into substance abuse or, say, the drug trade.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Those often require learning specific techniques and attitudes from people who are already experienced. You don't just wake up knowing how to do that stuff.
Right.
And it helps explain that gender gap we mentioned earlier. If males are more likely to socialize extensively with deviant peers and be influenced by them, that aligns pretty well with Sutherland's ideas.
What are the main knocks against differential association, though?
Well, one big one is, where do these definitions favorable to crime originate? The theory explains how they're transmitted, but not really how they first appear. Who was the first teacher?
Good question.
Another challenge is explaining seemingly spontaneous, maybe irrational acts, like some types of violent crime, that don't appear to stem from a systematic learning process.
Right, like crimes of passion.
Kind of, yeah. And then there's the birds of a feather critique.
Mm.
Maybe delinquents seek out other delinquents after they've already started offending, rather than learning the behavior from them initially. Is it association causing deviance, or deviance causing association? Chicken or egg?
The causality question, always tricky. But despite those questions, it's seen as a significant contribution.
Definitely. Its big contribution is that it tried to explain all types of crime, not just street crime or lower-class gangs. It can even help explain things like middle or upper-class delinquency, where kids might be exposed to pro-delinquent attitudes from, say, opportunistic parents or peers in unexpected places.
Okay, all right, let's move to differential reinforcement theory. This builds on Sutherland.
Yes. This theory, associated with Ronald Akers and Robert Burgess, builds directly on differential association, but crucially integrates principles from psychological learning theory, specifically the idea of rewards and punishments, or reinforcement.
So consequences matter.
Big time. It says deviant and conventional behavior are learned through the very same process, reinforcement.
So the consequences of your behavior getting rewarded or punished shape whether you do it again.
Exactly. It's direct conditioning. If a behavior is rewarded, positively reinforced, you're more likely to repeat it. If it's punished, you're less likely to. And negative reinforcement, like doing something to avoid a punishment or stop something unpleasant, also shapes behavior.
Okay.
Criminal behavior persists if the rewards it brings, maybe status, money, excitement, or the punishments it avoids, like boredom or failure at conventional tasks, are favorable compared to the rewards and punishments for conventional alternatives.
And where do we learn what's rewarding or punishable in this context? Still from our groups.
Yes. From those same significant others and groups we discussed earlier, peers, family, school, they're the ones who often control the reinforcement, define what's right or wrong in that context, and provide models for behavior.
So if your group values something deviant
And reinforces it, yeah.
Yeah.
Defining a behavior as good or justified makes you more likely to do it.
Yeah.
Think about that drug-using peer group again. They might value drug use, encourage it, provide models, and reinforce it socially with acceptance or status. That's social learning in action, shaped by reinforcement.
So the principal influence comes from those groups in differential association, but the mechanism includes this psychological reinforcement aspect.
Precisely. Deviant behavior is expected to the extent it's been differentially reinforced and defined as desirable or justified within those key groups. And social support from those groups can be a powerful sustainer of criminal behavior. This integration might help explain why criminality persists for some individuals over time.
Does the research support this combination? Does it hold up?
Yeah, studies often show a strong association between things like substance abuse and these social learning variables, particularly perceiving rewards for deviance from people you respect or admire. It also aligns well with rational choice ideas.
How so?
Well, it suggests people implicitly weigh risks and rewards, but their assessment of those risks and rewards is fundamentally shaped by what they've learned from their social environment.
Interesting connection. Okay, finally, under social learning, we have neutralization theory.
This is Gresham Sykes and David Matz's theory. It suggests that criminality isn't necessarily about rejecting conventional values altogether,
Oh,
but rather it's a learning process where potential offenders master techniques that allow them to temporarily neutralize or kind of override those conventional values. This enables them to drift between conforming and delinquent behavior.
drift, like they're not fully committed to either side, they just float back and forth.
Exactly. Matza observed that even people who commit crimes aren't always criminal. They often participate in conventional life, go to school, have families. He saw behavior as falling on a continuum between total freedom and total restraint.
Okay.
Drift is the movement along this continuum. And he argued it's made possible partly by subterranean values that exist in society, values that are maybe publicly condemned, but perhaps privately admired or even practiced, like thrill-seeking, aggression, using force to get what you want.
Things we might disapprove of but secretly find exciting.
Kind of, yeah.
Hmm.
Neutralization techniques allow temporary drift away from conventional behavior without rejecting it entirely.
And their observations about actual criminals led them to this idea.
Yes. They notice criminals sometimes show guilt or remorse. They often respect law-abiding people. They might draw lines about who is an acceptable victim. You don't steal from your own, that kind of thing. Yep. And they're not immune to demands for conformity. They participate in social functions. This led Sykes and Matza to believe that crime isn't a wholesale embrace of a deviant value system, but rather the result of learning specific mental techniques to neutralize accepted values just before or during the commission of a crime.
These techniques are the core of the theory, then.
Yeah.
What are they? Can you break them down?
Sure. There are 5 key techniques they identified, basically ways of making excuses for your behavior to yourself and maybe others.
Okay.
1, deny responsibility.
Right.
It wasn't my fault, I was drunk, or forces beyond my control made me do it.
Right.
2, deny injury. Nobody really got hurt, or they're insured, they can afford it. 3, deny the victim. They had it coming, they deserved it. Blaming the victim.
Okay.
4, condemn the condemners. Turning the tables, like saying everybody's picking on me, or the police are just as corrupt, everyone cheats on their taxes.
Deflecting blame.
Exactly. And 5, appeal to higher loyalties. Justifying the act because you were doing it for someone else, like I had to protect my friends, or I did it for my family, my gang needed me.
So these are basically internal rationalizations, mental tricks.
Exactly. They're mental maneuvers that allow a person to quiet their conscience, temporarily suspend their adherence to conventional norms, and enable that drift into criminal behavior without having a full-blown identity crisis.
How strong is the research support for neutralization theory? Does it hold water?
It's been a bit mixed, actually, particularly on the tricky question of whether people actually use these techniques before committing a crime. Is it a precondition, something they need to do first, or is it just post hoc rationalization, making excuses after the fact?
Timing matters.
It does. However, there is evidence supporting the idea that mastering these neutralizations does enable youths to engage in disapproved behavior more easily. And the concept of drift and the situational adoption of different behaviors, like switching between following a street code and acting decently, depending on who you're with, also finds some support in research.
What are the main contributions of this theory, then? What does it help us understand?
Well, one key contribution is potentially explaining the aging out process.
Oh, so?
The idea that maybe many young offenders weren't truly committed criminals, but were just drifting during adolescence, and eventually drifted back to conformity as they got older, got jobs, started families, and took on more conventional roles.
Okay.
It also helps explain occasional offenders who aren't chronically involved in crime, and it gives us insight into how individuals manage guilt or justify their actions, which can apply to adults too, not just kids.
And the critiques.
Yeah.
What are the weaknesses?
Besides that question of whether neutralizations precede the act, critics also wonder about the origin of the techniques themselves. Where do people learn these specific excuses?
Right, back to the origin question.
Yeah. And it struggles, similar to differential association, to explain really spontaneous acts or crimes committed while under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Are people really pausing to consciously neutralize in those moments? Seems less likely.
Good point. Okay, fascinating stuff. So that covers social learning. Crime is learned through association, reinforcement, and techniques of neutralization. Let's shift gears entirely now to our second major branch, social control theory. This one really flips the perspective, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Control theory starts from a very different premise. It
Yeah.
doesn't ask why people commit crime.
Yeah.
It asks, why do people obey the rules? Why don't more people commit crime?
Okay, that's a different starting point.
The underlying idea is that everyone has a potential to violate the law because, let's be honest, crime can often be exciting or offer immediate rewards or solve problems quickly.
So it's not about learning to be bad, but about what internal and external forces prevent us from acting on that potential. What holds us back?
Exactly. It's controlled behavior, not learned deviant behavior. That's the focus. It contrasts with other theories that might point to fear of punishment, like choice theory, or lack of opportunity, like structural theory, or learning, like we just discussed.
Right.
Control theory says our behavior is kept in check by internal forces like self-control or a moral compass, and by external forces, primarily our commitment to conventional ties and relationships, our bonds to society.
And when those bonds are weak?
When that commitment is weak or absent, people are freed up, so to speak, to violate the law because they have less to lose. The potential costs of crime don't seem as high.
Early control theory talked about self-concept, didn't it? Like self-esteem.
Yes. Early versions speculated that low self-control was linked to a weak self-concept or poor self-esteem. The idea, like in Walter Reckless's containment theory, was that a strong self-image helps insulate you from criminal pressures, like in inner containment. Howard Kaplan even suggested the opposite, that a very poor self-concept could actually lead to deviance as a kind of desperate way to try and raise self-esteem, to feel competent at something, even if it's disapproved of.
Interesting twist.
And there's research linking negative self-feelings, particularly stemming from feeling deprived relative to others, to antisocial behavior.
But the most dominant version, the one everyone talks about, is Travis Hershey's social bond theory.
Yes, Hershey's 1969 book, Causes of Delinquency, really laid out the central idea. The onset of criminality is directly linked to the weakening or breaking of the social bonds that connect an individual to conventional society.
So it's all about the ties that bind.
Pretty much. He assumes most people know the moral code, but vary in their response to it. People are potential violators, but they fear damaging the relationships and investments they have with parents, friends, teachers, employers. If those bonds are weak, that fear is lessened, and they're freer to commit crime.
And he identified 4 key elements to this social bond. What are they?
Yes, the 4 elements are really the heart of the theory.
This is sensitivity to and interest in others. The emotional bonds we form, especially with parents, which Hershey considered most important, but also friends and school.
Why is parental attachment so key?
Strong attachment to parents generally means you're more likely to respect authority and internalize their values. Family detachment, things like conflict, abuse, or just a lack of affection and supervision, strongly predicts delinquency.
Okay.
Attachment to education is also crucial. And interestingly, the source notes attachment to a child can act as a social control mechanism for, say, adolescent mothers, reducing their own deviance. Cross-national studies strongly support parental attachment as a key predictor.
All right, what's the second element?
Commitment. This refers to the time, energy, and effort you invest in conventional lines of action. Things like getting an education, building a career, saving money, basically your stake in conformity.
So what you have to lose?
Exactly. If you have a strong commitment to these goals, you have more to lose, so you're less likely to jeopardize your position by committing a crime. A lack of commitment makes risk-taking behaviors, including crime, seem more reasonable, less costly.
Makes sense. Third.
Involvement. This is simply being heavily involved in conventional activities, school clubs, sports, recreation, spending time with family. Busy hands are happy hands, kind of.
So just being occupied.
Yeah, the idea is that if you're busy doing conventional things, you simply have less time and opportunity to get into trouble. Hershey believed idleness enhanced criminal potential. Idle hands are the devil's workshop.
Okay. And the last one.
Belief. This is the extent to which you share and adhere to common moral beliefs respecting others' rights, valuing the legal code, believing the rules are legitimate and should be obeyed. If your belief in these conventional values is weak or absent, you're more likely to feel free to act antisocially.
And he saw these 4 as interconnected, working together.
Yes, they're not entirely separate. He suggested they reinforce each other. For example, strong kinship ties and sensitivity to parents and friends, attachment, can lead to setting legitimate goals, commitment. Rejecting those relationships might lead to a lack of commitment to conventional paths.
Did Hershey's initial research back this up? Did the data support his theory?
Yes, his original study using self-report data from high school students provided important support. He found that delinquent youth were indeed less attached, less committed, less involved, and held weaker conventional beliefs.
And subsequent research.
Numerous studies since then have largely corroborated this, showing that youth with weaker social bonds are generally more likely to engage in delinquency.
But there are also significant opposing views and critiques, right? It wasn't universally accepted.
Definitely not without debate. One of the major critiques challenges Hershey's idea that delinquents are often detached loners. Critics argue quite strongly that delinquents do have relationships.
But they're with the wrong people.
Exactly. They're often with other deviant peers or maybe even deviant family members, and these relationships can actually promote crime rather than deter it. Attachment to deviant peers, some argue, can actually escalate criminality, not reduce it.
So the type of attachment matters immensely. Attaching to pro-social people is good. Attaching to anti-social people, not so much.
Precisely. That's a major refinement. Another critique suggests that not all elements of the bond might be equally powerful. Some research suggests involvement, for instance, might have less influence than attachment or commitment.
Or maybe involvement could even increase opportunity sometimes.
Yeah, if you're out doing activities without supervision, maybe. Critics also point out that Hershey didn't fully address how bonds change over time. They aren't static.
And perhaps the most fundamental critique reverses the causality. What if crime causes weak bonds, rather than weak bonds causing crime?
That's a very important challenge, raised most notably by scholars like Robert Agnew. His argument is compelling. Engaging in criminal behavior itself can damage a person's relationships with parents, get them kicked out of school, or make it harder to find a conventional job. In essence, the crime weakens the bonds to society.
So the arrow could point the other way.
It absolutely could, and likely does in some cases. It's probably a reciprocal relationship. While this is a strong critique, it's important to note that empirical evidence also continues to support Hershey's original direction, that weak bonds do seem to make delinquency more likely initially.
So despite these debates and complexities, control theory remains highly influential.
It does. The sheer weight of empirical evidence supporting the association between weak social ties and youthful misbehavior means control theory, and particularly Hershey's version, is still considered a preeminent theory for understanding the onset of delinquency.
All right, let's move to our third major branch. Social reaction theory, more commonly known as labeling theory. This sounds quite different again.
Oh, this perspective offers a really unique and, I think, powerful lens. It suggests that people become criminals not necessarily because of what they do initially, but because significant members of society, parents, teachers, police, judges, label them as criminals or deviants or delinquents.
And they start to believe it.
And they eventually internalize and accept those labels as part of their personal identity. Behavior, from this view, is profoundly controlled by how others react to you.
So the deviance isn't inherent in the act itself, but in the societal reaction to the act.
That's the core interactionist idea, really articulated well by sociologist Kai Erikson. Crime isn't seen as an objective category. It's subjective, a property conferred upon certain acts and certain people by the audience, particularly by those who hold power in society.
And the law itself reflects this.
From this perspective, yes. The law itself reflects the values and interests of those who rule, those who get to define what's acceptable and what isn't.
And this leads directly to the idea of differential enforcement of the law, that it's not applied equally.
Exactly. A key principle here is that the law isn't applied uniformly. It often benefits the powerful and penalizes the powerless based on things like race, wealth, gender, social standing. Police discretion, for example, might favor privileged individuals.
We see statistics on this all the time.
Right. Minorities and the poor are statistically more likely to be arrested, prosecuted, and receive harsher sentences for similar offenses compared to more privileged groups.
You see this starkly in the comparison between how, say, white-collar crime is often treated versus street crime.
Absolutely. Labeling theorists argue that who you are, your social standing, and how justice system agents react to you become more significant factors in developing a criminal career than just whether you violated a specific law. The very content and application of the law, they say, reflect existing power relationships in society.
The theory seems less concerned with why someone commits the first deviant act then.
That's right. Labeling theory's main focus isn't on the causes of the initial rule breaking, it's on the impact of being labeled after an initial act has occurred. They argue that the less personal power or social resources you have, the higher the likelihood you'll be formally identified and labeled as deviant.
And the labeling process itself can be damaging.
Hugely. Public condemnation, like going through a trial or a juvenile court hearing what sociologist Harold Garfinkel called degradation ceremonies, can create irreversible labels. These rituals essentially separate the labeled person from the legitimate social order, marking them as other.
And being labeled has significant consequences for future behavior.
Major consequences. It can lead to what's known as deviance amplification. When you accept a negative label, it can damage your self-image, making you more likely to engage in the very behavior you've been labeled for. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
How does that happen? What's the mechanism?
Well, one way is through differential social control. The labeling process can lead to a reevaluation of yourself based on how you think others see you. These are sometimes called reflected appraisals.
Like seeing yourself through others' eyes.
Exactly. If kids internalize that parents or teachers see them as delinquents, troublemakers, they're more likely to eventually take on that role. Also, sometimes dysfunctional groups, like maybe drug-using families, might inadvertently encourage deviance instead of controlling it, kind of reinforcing the negative label.
And if you're labeled and maybe shunned by conventional society, you might seek out others who are also labeled. Find your tribe, so to speak.
Precisely. Labeled individuals may join similarly outcast peers, forming groups or subcultures that then reinforce antisocial behavior and make it habitual. This desire to join often stems from a self-rejecting attitude caused by the label, which in turn weakens their commitment to conventional values.
So the group provides acceptance, but for the wrong reasons.
Right. Membership in these deviant groups means conforming to norms that are often in direct conflict with conventional society. Sometimes their acts can even be defiant, doing things specifically to show contempt for the source of the label, like acting out against school authorities if they feel unfairly labeled there.
And the concept of retrospective reading, what's that about?
This is really insightful. Labels tend to redefine a person's entire identity, even looking back at their past. The label ex-con, for example, doesn't just describe a past event. It can conjure up a whole host of negative assumptions: tough, dangerous, dishonest, regardless of the person's actual character now.
So people react to the label, not the person.
Exactly. People start reacting to the label's description rather than the actual person standing in front of them. And their past behavior is often reviewed and reinterpreted, read retrospectively, to fit this new labeled status. Minor past incidents might now be seen as early signs of their deviance.
Wow, that's powerful. Frank Tannenbaum called this the dramatization of evil.
That's a very evocative term he coined. He argued that the negative feedback and reactions from social agents, police, courts, school officials, even parents can amplify the original label. The individual starts questioning their own identity if everyone important sees them as bad or deviant.
So the attempts to control can backfire.
Tannenbaum thought so. He saw the very efforts to control or treat the individual potentially reinforcing their deviant role, making it harder for them to escape it.
This leads us to Edwin Lemmert's crucial distinction between primary and secondary deviance. Can you explain that?
Yes, this is a fundamental concept in labeling theory, really helps clarify the process. Primary deviance refers to those initial, often minor norm violations or crimes that have very little impact on the person's self-image or lifestyle.
Like youthful indiscretion.
Exactly. It could be minor shoplifting, underage drinking, maybe some vandalism that goes unnoticed or unaddressed and is quickly forgotten. The person doesn't see themselves as a criminal because of it.
But secondary deviance is where the label becomes transformative.
Yes. Secondary deviance occurs when the deviant act comes to the attention of others, particularly formal control agents like the police or courts, who then apply a negative label. Crucially, the individual then begins to reorganize their behavior and their self-identity around the consequences of that label.
A label takes over.
It becomes a master status, defining who they are in their own eyes and in the eyes of others. They start to internalize that deviant identity, potentially leading to a more persistent pattern of criminal behavior that aligns with the label.
What does the research say about labeling theory? Is there evidence to back this up?
Well, research on who gets labeled largely supports the theory's premise that the poor and powerless are disproportionately affected by the justice system. Labels aren't distributed equally across social class or
We
race.
talked about differential enforcement.
Right. Studies show discretionary decision-making at every level. Policing, prosecution, sentencing can disadvantage minorities and the poor. While some argue these decisions are based purely on legal factors like offense severity or prior record.
Others disagree.
Others point to evidence of more subtle contextual discrimination where factors like race or class might influence decisions in borderline cases or specific situations, leading to harsher labels or outcomes.
And the research on the effects of labeling. Does being labeled actually change behavior?
There is empirical support showing that negative labels do influence self-image and subsequent behavior. Social sanctions can indeed lead to self-labeling and that cycle of deviance amplification.
So it's not just a theoretical idea.
No, parental labeling has been linked to problems in children. Repeat or official labeling seems to produce more damaged identities. Studies on adults labeled as addicts or domestic violence offenders sometimes show potential increases in offending after labeling, and labeled prison inmates often have more disciplinary issues, suggesting an internalization of that oppositional identity.
So it seems to play a real role in persistent criminal careers.
Absolutely. Stigma and labels are seen by many researchers as critical factors in explaining why some individuals become chronic offenders. Official intervention and labeling can create what's called cumulative disadvantage, meaning the label closes doors to conventional opportunities. It makes it harder to get education, harder to find good jobs. This limits the pathways out of crime, making it harder to return to a straight life and increasing the probability of future crime.
So while it might not fully explain the very first crime someone commits, it provides powerful insights into why someone might continue down a criminal path.
Precisely. That's a major contribution acknowledged even by critics. While they question its ability to explain the initial cause of crime, supporters emphasize its immense value in understanding the maintenance or continuity of criminal behavior. It really highlights the potentially unintended negative consequences of social control agents' actions.
Even programs designed to help can have labeling effects.
They can. Though interestingly, research on treatment programs that actively help offenders change their identity and overcome negative labels, sometimes called redemption rituals, also points indirectly to the power of stigma in the first place and the importance of addressing it for desistance.
Okay, so let's zoom out now and look at all three of these social process theories together. Learning, control, and reaction labeling. What are their overall strengths and weaknesses when you consider them as a group?
Well, a major strength is their compatibility in many ways. They all fundamentally see crime as integrated into the process of socialization. They focus on interactions.
Right, they all emphasize relationships and social context.
Exactly. They highlight how interactions with key social groups and institutions, family, school, peers, the justice system, shape a person's behavior, their beliefs, their values, and ultimately their self-image. And there's a massive body of empirical data that supports their basic premise. Delinquents and criminals often did grow up in dysfunctional families, struggled or failed in school, had difficulties maintaining conventional relationships or jobs later in life. The real-world correlations are there.
And the weaknesses, where do they fall short as a group?
While they don't fully account for broader, macro-level patterns and fluctuations in crime rates, why does crime go up or down nationally? Why are there geographic hotspots or even seasonal variations? These theories are more focused on individual pathways.
The more micro level.
Generally, yes. They also struggle a bit to fully explain escalation. Why do some people move to more serious crime? Or perhaps more importantly, desistance. Why do most people stop offending as they age?
That aging out phenomenon.
Right, and perhaps the most fundamental questions remain. If social bonds are broken, how exactly can they be effectively reattached? If crime is learned, how precisely can it be thoroughly unlearned? The theories describe the process as well, but are maybe less clear on the concrete path back.
Those are indeed challenging questions. But despite the weaknesses, these theories have had a huge impact on public policy, haven't they?
Absolutely, a massive impact, especially since the 1950s, and particularly for policies aimed at young offenders who are often seen, rightly or wrongly, as more malleable, more salvageable than adults.
How have learning theories specifically influenced policy? What kinds of programs stem from that?
They've heavily influenced treatment and rehabilitation approaches. The core idea is straightforward. If criminal behavior is learned, then theoretically it can be unlearned or replaced with conventional behaviors through new learning experiences.
So counter-programming, essentially.
Kind of, yeah. Programs based on this might focus on teaching offenders about the negative consequences of drugs, the benefits of staying in school, conflict resolution skills, essentially exposing them to conventional definitions and trying to reinforce pro-social behaviors and attitudes.
And control theories, how have they shaped policy?
These have strongly influenced programs designed to strengthen individuals' commitment to conventional action and, crucially, build those social bonds early in life before problems become entrenched.
Like intervention programs.
Exactly. A prime example mentioned in the source is the Head Start program, which was initiated as part of the war on poverty in the U.S. The explicit goal was to intervene early with lower-class youths to provide better socialization opportunities and hopefully strengthen those bonds to conventional institutions like school.
Head Start was meant to be really comprehensive, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Not just academic.
Yes, it's designed as a holistic program focusing on physical, mental, social, and emotional development. It aims to build self-image and positive interpersonal relationships by providing an enriched educational environment from a young age.
How effective has it been? There was some controversy early on, right?
There was. Early evaluations are sometimes controversial, often criticized for focusing too narrowly on short-term IQ gains, which sometimes faded. But more recent, longer-term research shows significant benefits.
Like what?
Higher rates of school completion, less grade retention, improved performance on achievement tests later on, and increased high school graduation rates.
So real long-term educational impacts.
Yes, and the source points to non-academic benefits too, like improved health and nutrition and positive emotional characteristics. There can even be psychological benefits for the parents involved in the programs. So while there were early debates, the best evidence available today suggests Head Start, which is grounded in control theory principles of strengthening bonds, yields positive results in the long run.
Okay. Finally, how have labeling theories impacted policy? They seem to suggest doing less.
That's right. Labeling theorists have famously advocated for caution regarding formal intervention, sometimes summarized as less is better, especially with young people. They argue that institutions trying to help can inadvertently stigmatize individuals, potentially pushing them deeper into a criminal identity.
So avoid the label if possible.
That's the core idea. This perspective has heavily influenced policies like diversion programs and restitution.
Diversion programs, can you explain those quick?
Sure. They aim to remove individuals, often juveniles, but sometimes first-time adult offenders, from the traditional court process and redirect them into rehabilitation or community programs. The goal is to address the underlying issues without applying the potentially damaging formal criminal label.
Then restitution.
That's where offenders compensate victims directly or perform community service instead of getting a formal sentence like jail time. Again, it's an attempt to resolve the issue and hold the person accountable without necessarily resorting to a formal, stigmatizing label from the justice system.
But these labeling influence policies also face critiques, don't they?
They do. Critics argue that diversion programs might simply substitute one form of stigma, like being known as someone in a mental health or drug treatment program, for another.
Trading one label for another.
Potentially. And they often screen out the more serious or repeat offenders, focusing only on low-risk cases, which limits their overall impact on crime rates. Plus, there's ongoing debate about how effective these alternative programs truly are compared to traditional methods in actually reducing recidivism rates in the long term. The evidence is often mixed.
So, quite a landscape. What we've seen today is that social learning suggests crime is acquired through interaction and reinforcement. Social control proposes that weakened bonds to society unleash that criminal potential we all might possess. And social reaction, or labeling, highlights the powerful and sometimes destructive role of being identified and treated as a deviant by society.
Exactly. These theories, while distinct, all provide essential insights into how individuals navigate the social world. They underscore how key relationships and institutions, family, school, peers, and yes, even the justice system itself can profoundly shape whether someone heads towards a conventional life or gets pulled onto a criminal one.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, it really leaves us with a crucial question building on everything we've discussed. If engaging in criminal behavior can weaken social bonds, as Agnew suggested, and if being labeled can solidify a criminal identity and create that cumulative disadvantage, what does it truly take for someone caught in that cycle to find a way back? To genuinely unlearn those criminal patterns, or to somehow reattach those vital bonds to conventional society after they've been seriously damaged or broken? It's a question that sits right at the heart of rehabilitation, desistance, and maybe even forgiveness.